Israel, I think, began to understand this paradigm shift that Tony has introduced for us probably around 20 plus years ago. In the mid-1990s, Israel was where Cape Town, South Africa, and many other places were. We were in a very significant drought. All of our water, all of our so-called stocks, in our case, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, groundwater aquifers, were all basically collapsing. The Sea of Galilee, actually, water levels were so low that people were saying that if the water level went any lower, it actually would drop below the level of the pumps. So you'd just be sucking air at that point. And this was really a turning point for Israel in the mid-1990s. And the realization was simply, as Tony has said, you no longer can manage water as a stock. You have to think about managing water as a flux. And I would add to what Tony was saying, is you have to think about water as a commodity. We want and we think and we would like always, there's this idea that water should and actually is a basic human right. You simply cannot deny people water because we all know that water is life. But at the same time, water is not free. It costs a lot. Not for the water, because the water is always free. But the jug costs money. Managing water costs money. Treating it, you're talking about treating water, storing water, pumping water. All of that costs money. So you have to think about water as a commodity, because if you don't, you're never going to get to a point of figuring out what are all the solutions that are out there. So in the mid-1990s, when we were in the midst of this crisis and all of our water resources were collapsing, all of our water stocks were collapsing, Israel said, look, the only way that we're going to get out of this crisis, A, to value water as it needs to be as a commodity, to understand that it's simply not possible to rely solely on natural water. And I think that is already beginning to insinuate itself in countries all across the world. And so what we began to do, of course, is think about where can we get alternative supplies of water, but also how do we manage what we have better? So supply side management, demand side management. And of course, I think you all know, because it's being talked about here in South Africa and of course Cape Town, desalination is one option. You should think about, how many the different options we have in our toolbox and how to use them and which ones should we prioritize and so on and so forth. So Israel began to understand, look, you've got this abundant water supply in the ocean, but of course, we've got to get rid of the salts. But it's doable. There's technology out there today. Desal today, anybody pretty much could figure it out. So that was the first thing that Israelis began to understand, is that you have to go beyond natural water supply because it's simply no longer a significantly predictable, reliable resource, partly, again, because of climate change. So we embarked on an era of desalination, and today Israel is 5 of the world's largest seawater reverse osmosis plant in any country, and 70 to 80% of our drinking water supply comes from the sea. So I say to people when they go to Israel, when you turn on the tap in your hotel in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or in Haifa, the water coming out of your tap is coming from a manufactured facility on the shoreline of the Mediterranean Sea. But that's not enough. That's not enough. You also have to value every single drop of water and put it into productive use. And Tony mentioned that. That's about reclamation of water. When we invest technologies to treat wastewater and then just dump it back into the rivers or sometimes into the sea, as I think is what happens here in South Africa, doesn't make, if you just think about it purely as a financial perspective, why are you going to invest all that money to treat water and then just dump it? Okay? So invest that money, treat the water, and reuse the water. Reclaim it, recycle it. Because again, there's no technological barrier to do that. So in addition to the desal, we take 90% of our sewage, we treat it, and we recycle and reclaim and reuse 80% of our sewage in the largest sector of water demand, which of course is agriculture. So when you go to a restaurant in Israel and you have your nice Israeli salad, if anybody has, they chop the vegetables to so small you can barely identify as a tomato or a cucumber, right? But that Israeli salad is irrigated with treated sewage. So I tell everybody, do your bit, go to the toilet, and yes, flush your toilet, okay? Because that toilet water that goes down the drain eventually ends up in your very nice, tasty, crunchy Israeli salad, okay? So it can be done, and Israel is not the only country doing it. And I know that it's going to happen here too in South Africa, whether it begins in Cape Town or it begins in another city in South Africa. Singapore recycles its sewage to such a high level of treatment that they drink their sewage water. All right? So all of these things are available. There are no technological barriers to any of this thing happening. The way I understand it, and Tony uses an analogy of 3 legs, I'd like to use 3 legs and a base, because you've got to stick your little 3-legged stool on something, otherwise it's sort of like hanging there in the air. So for me, I always think about that there's an algorithm one can come up with thinking about water. And it has nothing to do with how much water you have. It's about governance. So these are the decision makers, the policy, and so on. Who's in charge? Who's making the decisions? So on and so forth. It's about finance, which of course goes back to what I said earlier. Water is a commodity. Water is not free. Capacity is essential. When we talk about wastewater reclamation and we talk about desal, whether it be at local levels or at national levels, there is a level of expertise that is required. So capacity is important. But another part of capacity is what you were saying earlier. It's about education. It's about how the public understands and values the resource. So those are, let's say, my 3 legs. But then I have this base. And the base is information. And I think that's the most important thing, and sometimes the most prominent. You were saying how confusing, you're bombarded with all of this stuff. And of course, the internet, if anything, has made things even worse. Because the problem with the internet is, you have 24/7 information, but none of us have the appropriate filter. What's right and what's wrong and who's saying, you need information. You need data. Now we're in this era where people call big data, metadata. There's so much information out there, and it's actually becoming even more hard to figure out what to do. So I would say that the way to think about water and the way to move from crisis, and yes, I personally do not know if I could, manage my day-to-day life on 50 liters or less than 25 liters. I can certainly commiserate with the residents of Cape Town why that is a real issue of crisis and anxiety. To move from crisis to management, you've got to think about this issue very comprehensively. And I would like to say where Israel is today, Cape Town and South Africa will be tomorrow, because you guys will solve the solution. And the advantage here is you don't have to start from zero. It's happening all around the world. You can look at Israel, and you can look at Australia, and you can look at Spain, and you can look at Singapore, and you can look at Hong Kong. There are many, many, many good examples out there, and Israel, of course, is just one of them.